Well, hello everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Required Reading. I am Russ, and we are tuning in to another couple of chapters of the novelization of the 1978 movie Halloween. This is written by Curtis Richards, of course, based on the screenplay written by John Carpenter and Deborah Hill. So now we move on to chapter 4. They didn't know what to call him, and they didn't know what to do with him. He wasn't a man, so he couldn't be tried for murder. He wasn't even an adolescent. And although the law respecting juveniles was broad enough to cover a 6-year-old boy, it didn't seem appropriate that laws designed to handle vicious teenage punks, muggers, purse snatchers, and car thieves should apply to him. To look at him during the hearing before the magistrate was to see a handsome, almost pretty, rosy-cheeked little lad in a neat tweed suit, a tie, and highly polished shoes. His eyes were warm, his smile genuine, and when he spoke it was with artless sincerity. In fact, more than one newspaper report described him as charming. Yet the boy had, by his own admission, stabbed his sister 31 times, at least, the coroner testified. Probably more. The magistrate concluded that the boy was either mad or lying. He questioned the little fellow very closely about whether some other person had done the deed and thrust the blade into the child's hand, but the boy's insistence on his story and the absence of any other evidence, despite the fact that poor Danny, Judy's lover, was treated very roughly by the police detectives and came within an ace of being accused, compelled the magistrate to declare it an act of madness. Yet, knowing what sort of place the boy would be sent to and what sort of people he would be thrown in with, the magistrate agonized over the verdict that would deliver Michael into the hands of those howling maniacs and their gangster keepers that he had seen with his own eyes on a recent official visit to the downstate center at Smith's Grove. Looking ashen and exhausted, he reconvened the hearing a week later. Ladies and gentlemen of the court, in 42 years as a loyal servant of the law and of this court, I have never been asked to make as remotely cruel a decision as the one I am now compelled to make. Even as I speak, I am aware that I'm struggling to keep my eyes from gazing upon the accused in this bizarre episode, for I know that if I do, I may falter in my duty. Nevertheless, absent any evidence to the contrary, absent any witnesses, absent any other person to come forth with a confession, absent any contradiction in the child's story, absent any regret on the part of the accused, and above all, absent any sense of right or wrong, which is the foundation of the law with respect to the criminally insane, I have no choice but to remand Michael Audrey Myers to the Smith's Grove Sanitarium in Warren County, Illinois, where he shall be placed in the care of a resident psychiatrist who shall report to this court regularly. His case shall be reviewed no less than twice a year, and upon recommendation of the psychiatrist, the boy may be released back into the custody of his parents. Although it is impossible for me to conceive a lengthy stay from Michael, whose brutal act I believe to have been the product of a passing madness that I hope has discharged itself forever from his system, I am obliged to cite the law concerning criminally insane minors, namely that at the age of 21 they must be brought before the magistrate for a criminal proceeding. If Michael is still at Smith's Grove 15 years hence, he shall be brought before the court on the day of his 21st birthday, where he shall be tried as an adult for the murder of Judith Margaret Myers. I have, he said, holding up a sheaf of papers, prepared a list of supplementary instructions for the care of Michael at Smith's Grove, in the hope that the problems that exist in such institutions shall not damage his chances of returning to society as a normal, healthy, fully functional human being. This court is dismissed." He rose, and the courtroom, which was composed almost exclusively of newspaper reporters, rose with him. He pivoted, and still averting his eyes from the boy he had just sentenced to the living death of an insane asylum, passed through the rear door of the courtroom. Michael's parents sobbed as the boy was led out of the room by a stern-looking matron, and even the normally tough-skinned reporters who had seen everything looked wan and reflective. One observer, however, was unaffected. Sam Loomis, a round-faced man with a goatee and a head shaved bald, had been staring penetratingly at the accused boy. In all his years as a clinical psychiatrist, he had heard and read about such cases, but had never observed one personally, and so the Myers case had interested him keenly, particularly because Loomis was the resident in charge of juveniles at Smith's Grove. Like everyone else, Loomis had been deeply touched by the angelic appearance and manner of the little boy, until, as the boy was reciting the events of the evening of October 31st, 1963, his eyes had happened to lock with Loomis's. The man felt a chilly foreboding that almost curdled his blood. 6 months had passed since the hearing, and as required by law, Loomis now appeared before Judge Christopher in the magistrate's chambers. As they sipped glasses of port, Loomis noted how much the judge seemed to have aged. Loomis tactfully said something to this effect. "It disturbed me deeply then, and it disturbs me no less deeply now. It haunts my waking hours and my sleep. I don't think I've ever done anything so difficult in my life. But what could I have done? What would you have done? How is he?" "He is fine. Of course, in my professional capacity, fine must be defined." "Please, no psychiatric rubbish, Loomis. Just tell me about his behavior in plain terms." "In plain terms? He has done nothing to our direct knowledge that would indicate anything else but normality." "Direct knowledge?" "Judge Christopher," Loomis said, rising to his feet and distractedly running his fingers over the red and beige-bound legal volumes on the judge's shelves, "there have been some peculiar and unpleasant occurrences at Smith's Grove in the last 6 months, particularly in the juvenile ward." The judge leaned forward. "Like what?" "Well, first of all, you have to understand that as Michael is by far, maybe 8 or 9 years the youngest patient in the ward, he would ordinarily be the subject of a great deal of bullying. Yes, I would imagine so. Well, there hasn't been any attempt whatsoever, not so much as a pinch." The magistrate stroked his cheek. "And what do you make of that?" "The same thing you do, I'm sure. They're afraid of him. I have seen him turn the hardest delinquent in the ward to stone with a stare." The judge digested it. "And this is all you have to say? You feel this is sufficient reason for me to extend his incarceration?" "Then there was the matter of Gilden. The trustee, Gilden, is known around the ward for his pranks. The children love him. He's the only breath of fresh air in the place. One day, about a month ago, after Michael's arrival, old Gilden played one of his harmless practical jokes on the boy, one I've seen countless times." "What was that?" "Oh, he loosened the cap on the salt shaker so that Michael salted his dinner. The contents of the shaker fell into his food. As usual, it got a big laugh. It has become practically an initiation ceremony for the youngsters at the hospital. And Michael didn't think it was funny." "What did he do?" "Nothing at the time. But that night, Gilden came down with a case of cramps so severe he had to have his stomach pumped. It was analyzed as food poisoning." "But you think—" "Yes, though I don't know how the boy might have gotten to the kitchen or what he could have used. The juvenile ward is separated from the kitchen by a series of guarded or locked passages." "I see. Anything else?" Nothing quite as tangible, but other boys in my charge have become, well, rather restless since Michael's arrival. Like a herd of cattle that instinctively feels the presence of wolves out there in the darkness. They always seem to be on the verge of bolting, stampeding. The judge looked at him. Dr. Loomis, I think you know how profoundly unnerved this matter has made me, and how desperately interested I am in seeing Michael treated and released. I'm not overly impressed by the observations you've made this morning, and it's only your reputation that keeps me from making some rather critical remarks. Now, I want to know if the boy sticks to his story, understands what he did, feels remorseful, feels purged of the murderous hatred he described to us at the hearing, that sort of thing. Judge, said Loomis, collapsing into a leather chair. The boy's story and attitude haven't changed a whit since the hearing, though I have spent nearly 2 hours a day with him every day for 6 months. I have nothing to go on but my experience and my hunches, and I tell you, out of the depths of all I have learned and observed in 15 of exploration of the human mind, Michael Myers may be the most dangerous person I have ever handled. Loomis's crystal blue eyes locked with Christopher's and held them for a long moment. Then the judge pulled his gaze away and quaffed down the rest of his port nervously. Damn it, Loomis. I cannot run my court on hunches, hearsay, coincidences, or anything but hard evidence. So unless you can come up with something he says, something he does, I am going to seriously entertain the boy's release the next time you appear before me. Is that understood? Yes, Your Honor, Loomis breathed, taking his leave with no ceremony whatsoever. In the following months there were more occurrences, and in Loomis's mind there was no doubt whom to ascribe them to. Every time Michael was slighted, or fancied he was, by a staff member or another inmate, some awful vengeance was visited upon the offending person. It might be a day, a week, a month later, but Michael got even. The problem for Loomis was that no one ever observed the boy doing it directly. One day, as the boys were watching television in the lounge, a 15-year-old got up and turned the sound lower. Michael rose and turned it up again. The other boy turned it lower again. Michael accepted the situation with a resigned shrug. That evening, as the older boy showered, the water turned scalding. The lad was harmed only enough to discomfort him for a week, but it could have been serious, and everyone knew who was behind it. Yet, apparently, Michael had not left his room. There were other incidents. A nurse who quarreled with Michael fell down the stairs 2 days later, fracturing her pelvis. A boy who borrowed a game from Michael and forgot to return it suffered a vicious rash that hospitalized him for a month. What doubly disturbed Loomis was that subtly, but definitely, the boy was capturing the leadership of the juvenile ward, because no one dared to challenge him. Everyone, staff and inmates alike, indulged him, and so he pretty much got his way. Loomis wondered when his own turn would come, but it never did, and he believed it was because no matter how much Loomis challenged the boy, no matter how much he thwarted him, Michael knew that Loomis was trying to help him. The boy grudgingly acknowledged Loomis's authority, and that Loomis concluded was probably the only thing that prevented Michael from walking scot-free out of the institution. You could, you know, Loomis said to him one afternoon during their regular therapy session. That's how much they fear you. If you were to ask an orderly for keys, ask a guard or trustee to turn his back at the appropriate moment, you could stroll out of here. Such is the power you exert over them. Isn't that true, Michael? The boy's eyes clouded, and he shrugged his shoulders. I don't know what you mean, sir. Ah, but you won't do it, Loomis said almost smugly. You won't do it because you have it made here. Here you have your own little world. If you were to escape, why, what would await you out there but strife and hassle? So you stay here, snug and secure. Isn't that true, you little dip? Loomis caught himself. No matter what he believed, it was unprofessional to express it that way. And besides, when you got right down to it, no one had ever seen the kid do anything to anybody. Which is why, at the outburst of Loomis's frustration, Michael simply fluttered his long eyelashes, smiled, and said, "I don't understand, Dr. Loomis." Loomis dreaded his next 6-month review of Michael's case with Judge Christopher, because if Loomis couldn't produce any hard evidence of wrongdoing on Michael's part, the judge might very well order his release. So it went, through the summer and early fall. Then one day in mid-October, at the end of another fruitless therapy session, Michael dropped the bomb. "Can we have a Halloween party, Dr. Loomis?" Loomis's eyes all but bulged out of their sockets. "Ah, Halloween party! You of all people!" "All the other kids think it would be a wonderful idea. So does Nurse Kramer and Dr. Martin. He said he'd have no objection." "Nurse Kramer and Dr. Martin are my subordinates, and they—" "Are you sure you don't want us to have one?" Michael asked. His feelings were clearly very strong. "Of course, He caught himself in mid-sentence, and suddenly he realized a Halloween party might be just the thing. A plan formed in his mind, and after a moment's reflection, he said, "Well, actually, I see no harm." The mere announcement of the party proved therapeutic for most of the boys in the ward as they set to work industriously to create costumes and decorations. The costumes they chose were revealing their deepest fantasies, and this was an unexpected bonus for the psychiatric staff, who might otherwise have had to probe for months into their minds for the same material. In the last week before Halloween, Michael began to get restless and excited, edgy and irascible. Loomis was well aware of the psychiatric phenomenon known as the anniversary syndrome, wherein mentally disturbed persons relive the events of the previous year's trauma. Michael seemed to be following this classic pattern, and on the evening of October 31st, Loomis placed the staff on what he only half-jokingly called Red Alert. The children, the girls' ward had been allowed to join the boys for the occasion, were to be carefully observed, and Loomis wanted 2 staff members besides himself to do nothing else but watch Michael. Loomis needed not only an incident, but witnesses. The children were led into a little gymnasium where black and orange streamers had been festooned, and cutouts of witches and goblins, black cats and pumpkins made by the children had been taped to the walls. The children wore their costumes, and even the nurses and orderlies donned clever masks, hats, or costumes to join in the fun. Michael was dressed as a clown. After cake and soda, the games began. For obvious reasons, they were kept simple and non-threatening. But after a round of musical chairs in which a 16-year-old girl named Sophie had beaten Michael out for the last chair, had she known about the boy's reputation, she'd have given it to him. Loomis leaned forward alertly, scrutinizing Michael. The stage had been set for something. The next game was bobbing for apples. A huge vat had been borrowed from the kitchen, filled with water, and a dozen apples floated in it. The idea was for the children to pick an apple out of the water using just your teeth. After 8 or 9 children had gone, it was Sophie's turn. Michael stood 3rd or 4th in line behind her. She leaned over the lip of the vat, struggling to keep her hands behind her back to resist the temptation to grab the apple. The lights went out. It was not uncommon for the lights to fail at Smith's Grove, especially on windy nights when trees fell on power lines in rural areas, but it was not a windy night. Loomis had been prepared for anything but this. He leapt from his chair and ran into pitch darkness for the spot where he thought the vat was. He bowled over several shrieking children and groped the last few steps until he collided with the platform on which the vat stood. At that moment, the hospital's own emergency generators, which tripped on automatically when the main utility system failed, brought light back into the auditorium. Sophie lay face down beside the vat, drenched from the waist up. Loomis searched the room for Michael. He stood under a basketball backboard, at least 10 steps away, smiling. Loomis looked at the boy's costume and hands. They were completely dry. With a nurse, Loomis applied artificial respiration, and after a moment the girl brought up a large quantity of water, sputtering and gasping. The party was over. Loomis's trap had failed. But ultimately Loomis won, for on the day he was scheduled to drive up to the county seat to plead his case with Judge Christopher, he received a phone call from the bailiff of the juvenile court. The night before, Judge Christopher had had a massive coronary and died on the way to the hospital. Judge Christopher's successor was far less sympathetic to Michael Myers. He had only read about the case and was convinced Michael was the brutal killer that the psychiatrist claimed. Loomis presented the new judge with a 45-page paper describing Michael's personality and the incidents of the last year, and though there was still not a shred of evidence to support Loomis's contention that Michael was a homicidal psychopath, the new judge accepted Loomis's opinion that it was best to keep the boy behind institutional walls. And so it was that 15 years passed. Chapter 5. On the evening of October 30th, 1978, a new Buick station wagon sliced through the blackness of a rainy night on State Highway 116, heading east towards the Smiths Grove State Facility. On the front door of the sleek car was the institution's emblem. The only other thing that distinguished it from an ordinary car was the chicken wire grating that separated the front and back seats. Inside, her face illuminated by the eerie glow of the dashboard and the occasional orange light of her passengers' nervously puffed cigarettes, Marion Treadwell, RN, peered into the jet night. She wore a crisply starched white nurse's uniform and hat, and a navy cape with red piping around her shoulders. Her knuckles on the steering wheel were white. As if she weren't nervous enough about tonight's assignment, the foul weather made her as uptight as a drug addict looking for a score. As her passenger smoked and talked, Marion resisted the temptation to look at him. She'd heard so much about Dr. Loomis, both good and bad, and after glimpsing him when she'd picked him up in front of his home, she could see why he was spoken of with that mixture of reverence and dread that people reserved for Rasputin. His head was shaved bald, but he wore a gray goatee, giving him a slightly diabolical appearance. He dressed in a limp, wrinkled brown suit and not very rain-proof trench coat, and apparently gave no heed whatsoever to the conventions of good dress. His crystal blue eyes were awesome in their intensity, and you knew at once that mundane matters like proper attire were beneath the interests of a man with such eyes. In his lap he held a manila folder whose notes he tried to follow with his index finger in the light emanating from the dashboard. Then he gets another physical examination by the state, followed by an appearance before the judge. Bear in mind that this is not the judge of the juvenile court, because the subject is no longer a minor. In any case, the procedure should take 4 hours. If we're lucky, then we're on our way. As before, you will be heavily sedated. What did you use before? Thorazine. The driver frowned. Why, he'll barely be able to sit up. Loomis smiled grimly. That's the idea. Here we are. He gestured toward a large white sign fixed to a low brick wall on the left. It said, Smiths Grove, Warren County Sanitarium. Through the blackness and the downpour, she could make out the shadowy mass of the institution looming on the hillside, surrounded by a sturdy steel fence, above which ran 3 strips of no-nonsense barbed wire. The driveway's up a few hundred yards on your right, Loomis, indicating, gestured with a cigarette. The nurse, an attractive redhead, was slightly disappointed that Loomis hadn't asked her anything about herself. She guided the station wagon around the approach road. Loomis's indication that he intended to keep their charge drugged was typical of the rumor she'd heard about his rugged-jawed, single-minded man. It was said that the patients he treated successfully returned to the world completely adjusted and capable of leading normal lives. It was also said that those he thought incapable of recovery, he sedated until they were no more dangerous than a row of string beans. "Are there any special instructions?" she asked. For the first time, he looked at her directly. "Just try to remember what we're dealing with here. Don't underestimate it." Her eyes narrowed. "Don't you think we should refer to it as him?" Loomis shrugged. "If you say so," he said without conviction. "Your compassion is overwhelming, Doctor," she said, reaching for a pack of cigarettes. She took one out and slipped it between her full lips. Then she groped for her matches. Loomis reached into his coat for his lighter, but she found her matches first and lit her own cigarette. Now Loomis did look at her for the first time, noting the sheen of her auburn hair, the high cheekbones, the pert nose, as the flare of the match momentarily illuminated her attractive features. She put the matches up on the dashboard, but they slipped off as the car lurched to the right. Loomis picked them up off the carpeted floor. They said, "The Rabbit in Red Lounge, Entertainment Nightly." An odd name, he thought, and wondered whether the young lady frequented the place and what sort of entertainment one might be fortunate enough to see there. "Ever done anything like this before?" he asked. "Only minimum security." "I see," he said, failing to keep the pity out of his voice. "What does that mean?" she said defensively, picking up his tone. "It means..." He gazed at her, assessing her maturity and concluding she didn't have too much of it. "It means I see, that's all." "You don't have to make this any harder than it already is," she said forthrightly. Loomis's smile was devoid of humor. "I couldn't if I tried. The only thing that bothers me is their gibberish, when they start raving on and on." She finished the thought with a shiver and a look of disgust. "You don't have to worry about that," said Loomis. "He's scarcely spoken a word in years." Suddenly, in the middle distance, the car's headlights detected a ghostly shape about 25 yards away. Loomis leaned forward and peered, eyebrows knit in dismay. "Something is wrong." Marion lifted her foot from the gas pedal and hovered it over the brake, awaiting instructions as she squinted through the windshield into the troubled night. The wraith-like figure had momentarily disappeared. Then 5 of them appeared. Patients clad in wind-blown, rain-soaked white gowns, wandering or cavorting around the field outside the fence. Their eyes were hollow and almost zombie-like, their faces ravaged by decades of incarceration. "Since when did they let them wander around?" Marion asked cynically. "They don't," Loomis replied unnecessarily, gesturing impatiently for her to drive the rest of the way to the gate, where there was a telephone. "Drive! Drive!" A figure stepped in front of them, a male patient with an insane grin and red-rimmed eyes. Marion had to stop the car to avoid running him over. Loomis thrust open his door and jumped out. He trotted over to the bewildered escapee and asked him a question. The man gesticulated with wild, gnarled hands. Loomis's eyes clouded with fear. He rushed back to the car and hopped in, rivulets of rain trickling down his bald head into his face and beard. "Pull up to the entrance." "Shouldn't we pick him up?" "Move it!" Marion pressed the gas pedal. The rear tires whined on the wet pavement, then grabbed. The powerful car almost knocked the hapless inmate down. "What did he say?" "He asked me if I could help him find his purple lawnmower." "I don't think this is a time to be funny," Marion declared indignantly. "After all, "He said something else," Loomis said ominously. "He said it's all right now. He's gone. The evil's gone." They exchanged a serious look. "What does that mean?" "Wait here," he said, leaping out of the still rolling car and rushing over to the guard booth. He slid the door open and stepped on something soft. He knelt over it. It was the guard. His head was twisted on his neck as if some giant hand had tried to unscrew it. The man's eyes bulged hideously, and his tongue lolled over his bloody lips. "My God!" Loomis gasped as he reached for the phone. Inside the car, Marion drew nervously on her cigarette as the escaped inmates did their dance macabre around the parking lot. The driving rain drummed on the roof and hood, and Loomis's contorted face in the guard booth as he shouted his message to the main house did not make her feel any easier. All at once there was a tremendous thump on the roof, which buckled momentarily before popping back into shape. Marion glimpsed a flutter of white cloth out of the corner of her eye and realized what it was. "Oh no, one of them's on the roof of the car," she muttered, rolling the window on the driver's side down to plead with the inmate to get down. The noise on the roof was unimaginable, like someone dancing on it. Marion stuck her head out of the window. "Okay, that'll be enough." She did not see the powerful hand extending from the roof, but a moment later it had her by the hair and was attempting to pull her through the window. When the intruder realized he couldn't do that, he attempted to get a grip on her jaw to twist her head off. For a moment she shrieked with helpless panic, but Loomis either didn't see what was happening or couldn't help. There was only one solution before this monstrous hand snapped her neck. She groped desperately for the knob of the window and found it after what seemed like an eternity. She gave it a quarter turn with her free hand, but the problem was that her head was out the window, and the man's grip was too strong for her to pull back inside the car. Frantically, she clawed at the hand. A finger passed over her open, screaming mouth. She clamped her teeth on it with all her might. The thing let out an inhuman howl and momentarily relaxed its grip. She yanked her head back inside and closed the window on his hand. He roared again and pulled his hand out of the window before her last turn on the knob clamped him irrevocably. Marion clutched at her throat and gasped for air. She was momentarily safe, but an instant later she had her hands full at the window on the passenger side. The inmate still on the roof, it struck the window with shattering force, and the window's protective glass, it cracked into 1,000 geometric splinters that adhered to each other for the moment, but would fly into the car next time he struck it. The thing peered upside down into the car, and Marion saw a ghastly, rain-soaked creature made even more horrible by the spiderweb pattern of the cracked window. Now in blind panic, she stepped full on the gas pedal. The tires keened on the wet pavement, then took hold and the car lurched forward. Marion tore around sharply from left to right to left again. The car swayed and skidded, but the thing clinging to the windshield wiper and a door handle somehow managed to hold on. The rain cascaded down the windshield and she couldn't see a thing. She certainly didn't see the parking lot curb when she struck it at 40 miles an hour. The wheel tore out of her hand and her chin struck the rim. The station wagon spun wildly out of control, hurling her across the seat to the passenger side. Then it struck another curb broadside, and from that moment on, Marion remembered nothing until she was being helped to her feet by Loomis. She lay on the soaked grass of an embankment, a violent ringing in her ears. The nerves in her scalp throbbed from the pain of her hair having been violently pulled. About a dozen paces away, the station wagon sat idling. Loomis examined her and satisfied himself that she'd suffered no serious harm. Then he turned to the car. "Good God, there's someone in there!" He could see the ghostly shape on the driver's side, and it seemed to be frantically pounding on the steering wheel as if trying to make the thing go. Loomis dashed for the car, but just as he reached it, it vaulted forward, careening crazily from side to side until the driver seemed to gain mastery of the controls and roared down the road and onto the highway. Loomis returned to Marion, who was sobbing hysterically and shuddering from the rain and cold. Pulling her cloak closer around her shoulders, he held her tightly. Together they watched the taillights of the station wagon fade into the blackness of the Illinois night. Then he turned to her. "You can calm down now. The evil is gone." Somehow, she took no comfort in that at all. Chapter 6. Laurie Strode stepped out of the door of the white frame house on Oak Street and sniffed the air. It was cool and tangy with a faint touch of wood smoke. Someone had lit a fire in a fireplace somewhere down the street, and for Laurie, it had a special significance. It marked in her own mind the official start of winter. Of course, winter didn't truly begin until the third week in December, a little less than 2 months away, and you couldn't ask for a more autumnal event than Halloween, which took place tonight. Nevertheless, Laurie thought about winter and felt the same mixture of eagerness and dread that most Midwesterners feel about the season. She was a pretty girl, slim and angular, with straight brownish hair falling without fanfare to her shoulders. Farrah hairstyles were all the rage, but Laurie thought it was an affection and a pain in the ass to keep up. Though not exactly a bookworm, she had decided there were simply too many more interesting things to do, like reading, than to spend all that time washing, blow-drying, teasing, and combing, to say nothing of dyeing or frosting your hair if you really wanted to do that trip the right way. She dressed in simple school attire, a print skirt, knee socks, sensible shoes, and a boy's shirt under a sweater. Loaded down under 2 heavy book bags, she appeared to be round-shouldered and flat-chested, but that didn't worry her. She knew that when she set out to dress and make up for a date, she could hold her own with anybody in her high school class. But today was a school day, and there is no way you can look glamorous on a school day short of getting your own private porter of chauffeur to carry you and your books to school. So you do the best you can, and if your friends tease you about your waddle, you grin and bear it. She was slightly surprised to note several younger children already dressed in Halloween costumes. Then she realized they were not trick-or-treating at 8 in the morning, but merely dressed up for Halloween parties at school. Her cool blue eyes warmed as 2 little 6-year-old girls with eminently solemn faces glided by in satin gowns and rhinestone tiaras, turning occasionally to bark warnings to the gruff little pirates and cowboys who teased them 10 paces behind. She wasn't sure if one of the boys was Tommy Doyle, for which she was babysitting tonight. Babysitting. Number 1 boring job. Boring. Some of her girlfriends used babysitting as a means for making out. Perhaps if Laurie were interested in somebody, she might do the same thing, but there wasn't anybody in her life right now. So it looked like she would be spending another evening supervising Tommy's addiction to horror movies and satisfying his cravings, and she admitted her own, for popcorn. She thought about what her girlfriends did with their dates on babysitting jobs. Some of them had confessed, even boasted, that they went all the way with their boyfriends. Laurie wasn't inexperienced, and she wasn't a prude either, but she knew herself well enough to understand she wouldn't be able to handle that trip at the tender age of 17. In fact, she sometimes wondered if there was something wrong with her, if she was a little retarded or something. The smoldering fires of adolescence had never really tortured her body the way it did to some of her friends, like Annie, for instance. And although almost everybody in her class smoked grass, she not only had never gotten high, she couldn't draw the smoke into her lungs without coughing, and she was too smart to be interested in any other kind of drug. Laurie, she said under her breath, shaking her head morosely. At this rate, you'll end up as sensible as your mother. What a drag. What are you dreaming about there, sweetheart? Came her father's voice from behind. Chester Strode stood on the front doorstep, fooling with a keyring. Oh, the usual, sex and drugs, she laughed, knowing he wouldn't take her seriously. Ah, thank goodness, he said. I was worried you were ODing on English Lit and political science. No danger of that, she retorted. My parents brought me up to be a straight and decent kid. They walked together to his car, a black sedan with Strode Real Estate emblazoned in bold red and white on the door. It never failed to embarrass her, this advertisement glaring at people wherever they drove. Maybe things like this were done in Cleveland or Chicago or St. Louis, but in a small town like Haddonfield, most people kept a low profile. Oh well, it brought Daddy business, and, as her father was fond of pointing out, business meant food and clothes and a college education, so she couldn't really complain. They stood beside the car for a moment until her father managed to slide the proper key off his ring, which had so many keys on it, he called it his occupational affliction. He looked like a jailer. Handing a simple brass key to her, he said, "Now don't forget to drop this off at the Myers place." "I won't," she said. She decided to keep it in her hand instead of dropping it in her book bag, where it would be out of sight, out of mind. "They're coming by to see the house at 10:30. Be sure you leave it under the mat." "I promise." She started to walk away. "Haven't you forgot something?" he called after her. He stood by the car, head tilted, exposing his freshly shaved cheek. Laurie walked back and put her lips hastily to his cheek, hoping none of her girlfriends were watching, then feeling guilty immediately afterwards. Why should a girl be embarrassed about kissing her own father, for crying out loud? She set out down Oak Street, rolling slightly from side to side with the weight of her books. The famous Laurie Waddle in her right hand, the key to the Myers house, seemed to tingle, and suddenly she found herself thinking about the house. It was the one property her father handled that he was ashamed to speak of, and his relief at unloading it for once far outweighed his profit motive. For this was the house in which a 17-year-old girl had been brutally slain by her little brother 15 years ago. The Myerses had moved away a few months after the tragedy. The grief, shame, and harassment by the press and gawking neighbors and passer-by had made their lives in Haddonfield intolerable. From somewhere in Indiana, they continued to pay their mortgage and their taxes, which, as Laurie's father had often said, was a terrible double burden. Not only could they not find a buyer all those years, but they had to bear the emotional burden every time they wrote out a check to support the unsellable house. Chester Strode had used every trick in his prodigious salesman's bag to sell the white turkey, as he'd come to call it. But as soon as prospective buyers heard about the events of October 31st, 1963, from neighbors all too eager to tell them, their superstition invariably got the best of them, and it was goodbye sale. Mr. Strode couldn't even persuade customers to buy the property for the value of the land. "Buy it and raise the house if that's the way you feel," he would tell them. But the property was tainted, and no one went for the bait. Thank God for the New York couple who thought the house was just what they were looking for, and who were too sophisticated to believe the nonsense the neighbors prattled on about. In fact, the New York couple actually thought the idea of a haunted house was charming, something they could boast about. So Mr. Strode gave the New Yorkers something else they could boast about, a price so ridiculous it was, to use his patented phrase, lower than a song. Laurie wondered what it must have been like that night for the Myers girl, seeing her tiny brother coming at her with that enormous butcher knife. Imagine a blade that long going into her stomach, her breasts, even her. It was unspeakable, unthinkable. "Hey, Laurie!" Rarely had she been so relieved to be pulled out of a fantasy. The caller was Tommy Doyle, the boy she was sitting for tonight. The 8-year-old with tasseled brown hair and bright eyes trotted up to her, swinging 2 or 3 books strapped together with a belt. Laurie, whose own load of books qualified her to join the Stevedores Union, sighed at the symbol of vanishing youth. "Hi, Tommy." He caught up with her, and they walked side by side for several paces. "Are you coming over tonight?" "Same time, same place." "Can we make jack-o'-lanterns?" "Sure." "Can we watch horror movies?" "Sure." "Will you read to me? Can we make popcorn?" "Sure." Her answers came absently and automatically. They were the same questions every time. But this time she was thinking about poor Judith Myers as they turned the corner and walked the 100 paces into Peacher Street, where the Myers house was. She couldn't purge her mind of that awful picture of a knife, a long, silvery knife, flashing through the air and plunging into her body, a knife wielded by a... How old are you? They had stopped abruptly, and Laurie was staring at the boy. You know how old I am. I'm 8. Why? She hesitated, not wanting to put murderous thoughts into the head of the kid she was sitting for tonight. Yet there was something she had to know. Have you ever felt like killing somebody? The boy shrugged. Sure. You have? Sure. Hasn't everybody? They have? Her eyes bulged. Sure. When somebody takes something away from you, or your parents tell you you can't have something, or the teacher gives you too much homework, you feel like killing them. Is that what you mean? Well... Oh, that's what you mean, Tommy said, eyes rounding and the color draining from his face. They had arrived at the Myers house. It was a ghost of its former self, weather-beaten and dilapidated. Set back from the street 20 or 25 paces, it stood glowering in the cool autumn morning like some mangy brooding beast, its former spanking coat of white paint, the symbol of pride of every fine Midwestern home, had turned to dingy gray, and much of it had peeled or flaked off, revealing a pitted and rotting facade of shingles. Several windows had been broken by kids or vandals, a few of whom had been bold enough to scrawl graffiti on the front door. A huge elm beat against the upstairs window as the breeze stiffened. You're not supposed to go up there, the kid said, freezing to the spot. Laurie flourished the keys. Yes, I am. That's a spook house. Just watch, she said, walking coolly up to the porch. She lifted the welcome mat as her father had instructed and placed the key under it. She had wanted Tommy to know how unafraid she was, but if she was so unafraid, why was her hand damp with perspiration as she pulled it back from the mat? For a moment she stood transfixed, contemplating that night 15 years ago. My God, 15 years ago to the very night, she realized, when the tragic event had taken place. She vaguely heard Tommy on the sidewalk pleading with her to get away from there, but the horror of it attracted her in some perverse way. Was it the fascination of the innocent with the wickedness? Or just some sort of sick curiosity? Or was she herself capable of the same gruesome deed? She shut her eyes and imagined herself picking up a butcher knife and plunging it into the breast of whom? Whom did she loathe so much she would want to do that? To somebody in your own family, for God's sakes. She couldn't think of a soul. Laurie, please, I'm getting scared. The boy was whining. So am I, she laughed with a shudder, trotting down the porch steps and joining her young companion. And as she turned her back on the house, a figure inside it, dark, shadowy, sidled up to the front door and pushed the tattered curtain aside with a knuckle. He watched the slim blonde toss her head and laugh as she raised her hands like a boogeyman to frighten her young companion. He breathed heavily, raspingly, as he watched the girl, and a memory entered his mind. The memory of another girl, another blonde, willowy and pretty. He remembered the trapped and frightened look in her eyes, and the futile, pathetic way she had raised her hands to protect herself. He followed the girl and boy with his gaze until they disappeared from view. Then he walked up the creaky stairs to the second floor and peered into the room where it had all happened. I thought you liked to be scared, Laurie teased Tommy. God knows you groove on horror movies enough. Yeah, but those are movies. You can always turn the television off if you get too scared. You can't turn off real life. That's very wise, Tommy. Lonnie Elam said never to go up there. Lonnie Elam said that it's a haunted house. He told me about some real awful stuff that happened there once. Lonnie Elam probably won't get out of the third grade. I gotta go. I'll see you tonight, Tommy said, breaking away. See you. She paused on the corner, feeling odd, as if someone was boring into the back of her skull. She turned and gazed back at the Myers house. She could just make out the gable of the bedroom where Judith Myers had been killed. Her eyebrows knit. Was she crazy, or was there a shape standing in the window staring at her? She rubbed her eyes and looked again. No, there was nothing there after all. Her imagination was working overtime again. She pivoted and continued down the street to school, trying to stride smartly, but rolling with a slight waddle that everybody knew belonged uniquely to Laurie Strode. Okay, guys, that is it for this episode of Required Reading. I hope you enjoyed chapters 4 through 6. I know I definitely did. It's very cool to hear some of the things that you don't get to see in the movies, like the background that we get on Michael as he's a younger person in the insane asylum, or, hey, even Michael's middle name. I didn't know that. So anyway, I hope you will join me again next time for the next 3 chapters. But in the meantime, be good to each other and keep reading.